listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the honor of interviewing Jay Rooney. Unlike most guests I interview on this podcast, Jay is not an author, but he is a writer. Specifically, Jay is the writer and publisher of the Game Word newsletter on Substack, which is a fast-growing online platform. I'm here with Jay Rooney, who, unlike most of my guests on this podcast, is not a book author, but he's the publisher and writer of the Game Word Substack newsletter. Jay, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. Happy to be here.
Now, feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. So my name is Jay Rooney, and I'm the publisher of Game Word, which is a weekly long-form email newsletter and companion podcast that explores the intersection of video games with the arts, sciences, and humanities.
Covered my next question, so I'm going to move on to the one I had after that. As someone who is new to using Substack myself, I recently launched a Substack called Apollo Thoughts, which is more of a general topic Substack. How does Substack...
Congratulations.
How does Substack work, and what are some points of advice you would offer to people who, like me, are new to writing a Substack newsletter?
Yeah, sure. So there are many wonderful things about Substack. From the point of view of someone who's starting out, they make it very easy to just get going, just sit down and write. You don't have to worry about, things like layout and design and color scheme, though you could. If you want to customize your color schema, you could, but it's not strictly necessary. You could go from sign up to writing your first post in a matter of seconds, really. And the whole interface is designed with that in mind, just to make it easier to just sit down and write. And that is golden. So much better than writing in a word processor. The other good thing, the other one of the many good things, is that Substack itself, just as a company and as a team, are genuinely interested in and invested in your success as a writer. They have launched many awesome features lately to help specifically with growing your subscriber base. There's a very powerful network effect that kicks in once you start growing past a certain point and people start recommending you. There's the team and the community is very supportive, responsive, and has been absolutely invaluable to me when I was getting my start. So if you're a new writer, I would say that my number one piece of advice would be to engage with the community and stay in touch with the community. Go to the weekly office hours threads on Substack. There's a Discord server that we use that Substack writers use, a Twitter group. There are, and Substack also will sometimes do these sort of workshops, and some of them are specifically geared towards new writers or growing writers. So if you're able to sign up for one of those, and they're free, then I highly recommend that as well. Basically, use your resources. Writing can be a lonely calling sometimes. So it's also nice to have, it also provides a nice little social element if you're working at home, which as a full-time writer, I certainly am. And they're very helpful, and they've been through it. They've had their successes and their failures, and they're willing and they're very generous with their time and their expertise. And it's not weird or competitive like it can be in other writing groups. It's people genuinely want to be helpful. So I think the community is a very underutilized asset for new writers, one that I would suggest that new writers take full advantage of.
Now, Do you have a set routine about how you write articles for Game Word? And if so, what is that routine like?
Yeah, so I have one as best as I can. I have a kindergartner, and and I also do client work on the side. I teach a writing course as well. So my schedule can be a little hectic. So the schedule is more kind of broad, but roughly speaking, so my publishing date is Sunday morning. So every Sunday morning is when I publish a new article. So on Monday, I will start brainstorming. If I'm not already writing a series or something I already know what the topic is going to be, then I'll brainstorm it. I'll spend the day just kind of looking through gaming news, kind of like history websites, playing games as well. It's funny how I play for work now, but playing games is a big part of it as well, and it's kind of getting some things stewing in my mind, and then from about Tuesday to Thursday, I will work on the first draft, and the articles average about 5,000 words or so, so it's a lot of writing. And then on Friday and Saturday, I will edit, I will source pictures, graphical elements if needed. I'll start putting together like the social media promos. I do it's called a subscriber chat where people can chat with you in real time, and I'll prepare threads for that for the week. So I start, thinking kind of the more promotional aspect of it, and also who can I reach out to partner with on any content collaborations. And then on Sunday, I usually finish Sunday morning at about 5 a.m. I schedule the post, it goes out, I rest on Sunday, and on Monday I do it all over again.
Now, what content is available for free on your newsletter and what content is behind a paywall? And I'm asking this question because Substack seems to try to encourage its writers to make some of their content available for free and then put the full experience behind a paywall.
Yeah, and that is a question that not just me, but I think just about every Substacker that runs a paid newsletter grapples with at some point, or continually grapples with. I've tried experimenting with many kind of different strategies for the paywall. I've tried doing bonus subscriber only content. I've tried doing early access where subscribers get the article early and then I lift the paywall later on in the week. I've tried doing I've tried doing no paywall and just having it be just a voluntary contribution. What I'm currently doing now is that the most recent 2 articles are free and available to all. After that, any older articles go behind the paywall. And since I now have a year and counting of long-form evergreen content, and the subscription really isn't that much, all things considered. I charge $7 monthly and $50 annually. It's really a pretty good value, and that's not even including the podcast and the video essays I do sometimes, and some other fun kind of multimedia experiments I have planned for 2023.
You made a brief reference to the companion podcast to your Substack newsletter, which I believe is called the Game Word Podcast for yours. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, what
Correct.
type of content is typically featured on your podcast, and how does Substack allow users to create a companion podcast to their newsletter?
Yeah, so they like the writing part. They make it very easy and streamlined. their kind of thing is, I think they're starting to try to move away from being seen as like a newsletter company and more kind of an all-encompassing like multimedia publishing platform. So they've been building out their audio and video publishing capabilities quite aggressively at least over the past year that I've been on it. You just create a podcast episode. There's a specific template for audio episodes. You upload it. You upload the audio. You can type the rest of the post however you want. If you want to do a transcript or just like references, whatever, it's up to you, or nothing at all. It's your call. And then, you just go in the back end and flip a few switches and enter a few logins, and then you can distribute your podcast to your Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all the major podcast networks. So they actually make it really easy, and thank goodness, because otherwise I may not be doing the podcast. As far as content goes, what I'll do is I'll find an expert of some sort. Usually a credentialed, but not always, not necessarily. That's knowledgeable about either the topic that the current season is themed on, or at least something somewhat peripheral to it, and who has at least some familiarity with the gaming world. And then it's basically a Q&A session, right? And I'll usually focus on, say, a book that I reference as a part of my series and my newsletter, and sometimes it's just a conversation where we just geek out about games, but it's all in all it's very informative and fun. It's like a fun conversation.
Now, as the normal subject matter about this podcast is about authors, literature, and book publishing, what are some links between video and tabletop games and literature?
Well, so a game at the end of the day is a story. Sure, it's primarily a game, and games can be not have stories, but nowadays, but just about every game will at least have some story, even if it's a paragraph of like background exposition, right? To frame the whatever you're mechanically doing in the game, right? So as like a story in, say, like a novel, right? The story has to be written, and literary devices are actually very easy to spot in games if you make the conscious decision to look for them. And I've done literary analyses on series of games before, and I'm planning to do a few more actually in the near future. And I also cover a topic that comes up a lot in the podcast too, specifically is narrative and storytelling in video game contexts, right? So, because a video game story can't be told in the same way that a story will be told in a book or a movie, right? You have to tell the story in a way that's appropriate to the medium, and this is something that that game writers are still figuring out and still kind of hashing out. So it's a very exciting time to be involved in narrative design. But yeah, it's basically every story needs a protagonist, right? The player character, an antagonist, a central conflict, a structure, a setting, right? So all the settings so all the elements that you see in literature, you'll see in games as well.
Now, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons before, but I've found the alignment chart to be very useful in, determining what type of character a particular character is like in a book. For example, lawful good is almost always a protagonist, chaotic evil is almost always an antagonist, and the lawful evil and chaotic good can be either.
Generally speaking, yeah. No, yeah, there's Dungeons and tabletop gaming in general is a phenomenal untapped resource for authors, no matter what they're writing. I always, when people ask me, "Oh, how do I get involved in like game writing?" Right? I always say, play Dungeons and Dragons, play a tabletop role playing, and even better, like run a role playing campaign because it'll teach you everything you need to know about characterization, right? About building compelling characters and acting them out. Um, it teaches you about world building. It teaches you about how to structure your story and how to create tension, and it teaches you about pacing and in a game context, this is really important. It also teaches you how to respond to and grapple with the fact that players will often do the exact opposite of what you're expecting them to do, right? And how do you adapt to that? Which isn't so much of a concern like if you're writing, say, a novel, but everything else still applies. And Dungeon, there are resources for game masters that are just as useful if you're writing a book. There's books with, they're called character tables where you roll a dice and based on the result, you could pick out like the name, the traits, all that stuff. There's whole workbooks and worksheets. There's also entire stories in a can that you could use as inspiration or adapt for your story. That whole world has a treasure trove of resources that authors would find very useful. But I don't know how many are even aware of it. So hopefully some of your listeners will now know and can check it out. It's been very useful for me, certainly.
Now, can playing video games or tabletop games help authors be better at writing? And if so, how? And if this kind of goes into what you've already discussed, I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's fine. There's actually some nuance here. I'm happy to get into it. So with tabletop games, I talked about running a tabletop game, right? And but you could also just play, right? One person will run the game or the campaign, as they call it. The campaign is a story, and then the rest will play as characters in the game. And even just playing is helpful because it stimulates your imagination, right? So, I love video games, but a big advantage I think tabletop games have over video games is that, you have to use your imagination to visualize what's going on, right? So it stimulates your imagination, which, if you're a creative professional, is priceless. It shows you how to adapt, right? How to improvise, right? So if if the whole plot point that you've been building towards turns out to not be the best thing for your story, well, how do you adapt to that, right? And and on a deadline, right? So how do I adapt to it fast? Playing a tabletop game can teach you that, and teach you that by direct experience, right? Which is the best way to learn it, in my view. But even video games can help as well, because kind of like how reading other authors kind of helps you assimilate their perspective and their worldview, kind of by osmosis, right? And that's why we always say, the more you read, the better you write. It can be a similar deal with video games if you're, if you're playing kind of more story-centered games, because you're also taking in the story, right? And then even if subconsciously, you're taking in how the narrative designer is kind of pacing out the game and how they made these characters and then if you're consciously, with a critical eye, analyzing it and deconstructing it even better. So I would say, a lot of the techniques and devices, not all of them, but a lot of the narrative techniques and devices that we use as writers, as book writers, can also apply to video games as well, with a few adaptations,
Now,
and vice versa.
I have one final question. In addition to your work for Game Word, have you considered writing books?
I sure have, actually. And my kind of big goal for 2023 is to publish my first Game and Word book. Right now, it's still in ideation. It's very, very preliminary, very early stage. So not much that I can speak to now, but it is high on my to-do list. Let's put it that way. A lot of people have suggested it, actually. So I think it's something that would that would resonate. And I've self-published. I self-published a novella before, and I'm somewhat familiar with the process. So short answer, yes, absolutely. Long answer, what that's going to look like, stay tuned. Well, Jay, I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, and there will be a link to the Game Word Substack newsletter in the text description of this episode once it's published. All right. Thank you so much for having me, Aaron. I'll include links to both Jay's Game Word Substack and my own Substack, Apollo Thoughts, in the text description of this episode. I'll be writing articles for Apollo Thoughts on a regular basis throughout this year and beyond, and most of them will be about writing-related or political topics. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination even if it isn't a book manuscript. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.